Well, hey there, and welcome to U.S. History with Lennox. Today we're talking about APUSH topic 3.10, Shaping a New Republic. And what we're going to dive into is how the new Constitution was put into practice through the presidencies of both George Washington and John Adams. Now, after the Constitution was ratified, George Washington is going to be elected the very first president of the United States. And one of the first things he does is establish his cabinet. Now, his cabinet is going to be constructed of secretaries from four main departments in the executive branch: the State Department, the Treasury Department, the War Department, and the Justice Department. And the establishment of a cabinet, well, that was the first precedent that Washington set, still in play today. Now, the cabinet position I want to talk about is the Secretary of the Treasury. That was Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton was tasked with fixing the U.S. economy. And the way he did that was by establishing a national bank. He said through establishing a national bank, the states would be unified, and on top of that, the United States would be able to build a credit rating. Now, the way he implemented this was by combining all the state debt from the Revolutionary War into a single national debt. He's going to get some pushback from that because there were a number of states, specifically those states in the South, who really didn't have much debt, and now they were part of an overwhelming national debt. But what Hamilton will argue is that in establishing this debt, the United States would be able to obtain credit, as well as see an increase in the dependency of the states on the federal government. Well, those who opposed it, their first question was, is this constitutional? Because quite honestly, there is nothing in the U.S. Constitution that says the federal government has a power to create a national bank. Hamilton's argument is going to be that the necessary and proper clause is what provides for the national bank. You see, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution very clearly outlines all the powers that the legislative branch has. However, there's a little statement at the very end of Article 1, Section 8 that essentially says anything not listed that is necessary or proper for the governing of the United States is allowed by the Constitution. It presented kind of a gray room, a little wiggle room, if you think about it. But this necessary and proper clause, also called the elastic clause, allowed the national bank to be created. And once we got through that, the plan worked. Our economy was up and running. So the national bank falls under what we call domestic issues, issues that occur here within the country. But Washington also had to deal with foreign issues. Shortly after he took office, the French Revolution started, and there was a debate within our country as to whether or not we should aid the French in this war. George Washington will argue that our country is much too young and, quite honestly, much too broke to get involved. And he's going to have some people who are quite upset with him, one of them being his Secretary of State, George Washington. As a result, Washington is going to formally declare that we're not getting involved in this war, and he's going to issue the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793. Now, there's going to be people who are upset with that, most notably his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, but also the French Foreign Minister, Edwin Genet, who was here in the United States. Genet is going to anger Washington when, in his frustration with the proclamation, he starts going to the American people to try to drum up support for the United States getting involved in the French Revolution. Washington's having none of that, and he is going to try to kick Genet out of the United States. Well, he essentially tells the French foreign government, come get your guy, he's out of here. But Genet actually ends up staying in the United States and becomes a citizen. Meanwhile, the British are still on American soil. They have their forts throughout the western half of the United States territory. In addition, we're still having problems with the British impressing U.S. sailors into service into their navy. So John Jay is going to be appointed to go to Great Britain and try to negotiate a peace. Try to negotiate it into their presence on the western frontier, as well as to stop taking our sailors. The British are going to agree to leave the West, which they don't, and they never even had a conversation about impressing the sailors. So really, the only thing that Jay's treaty seemed to accomplish was kind of ticked off the Spanish, because the Spanish saw that the U.S. was starting to essentially flex its muscle, not only here in North America, but globally as well with these negotiations. And so they're going to start upping their game here in North America as well. They're going to start expanding their missions throughout their territories in the western half of North America, specifically in California. Seeing all this take place and knowing that the Spanish occupy Spanish Florida, Washington is going to send Thomas Pinckney to Spain to negotiate peace with them. Pinckney's treaty in 1795 is going to have two substantial accomplishments. Number one, Spain will allow the United States to use New Orleans as a port for trade, giving us access to the Mississippi River. On top of that, Spain agrees that the northern border of Florida is going to be along the 31st parallel. So even though some people weren't too happy with Washington's foreign policy, things seem to be relatively calm on the international front. Not so much here back at home. After the victory of the American Revolution, you see a lot of people starting to move west into the Ohio River Valley. And you know who that's going to upset: the Native Americans. And we started to see an uptick in Native American uprisings. And rumors were spreading that those British soldiers on the western frontier who never left after Jay's Treaty, well, they were arming the Native Americans. This is going to lead to a confrontation at what is known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where the U.S. Army is going to face off with a confederacy of Native American tribes. And they're going to defeat those tribes. In the end, the Native Americans are going to agree to leave permanently the Ohio River Valley, opening it up for more westward expansion for the United States. Another major event that's going to take place domestically during Washington's administration is the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Part of Hamilton's financial plan was a tax on whiskey, and Western farmers in Pennsylvania weren't too happy about it. For the most part, these are poor farmers who like their whiskey not only for libations, but also whiskey served as a form of currency in the western part of Pennsylvania, and they did not want to pay a tax on that. So when tax collectors from the federal government started showing up, they started to attack them and refused to pay the tax. Well, I want you to think back a few years to Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion took place in western Massachusetts during the governing of the Articles of Confederation, and farmers there revolted against the federal government due to property taxes. Well, due to the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, the federal government really couldn't do anything. But now we have a new government, the U.S. Constitution, a much stronger federal government. And George Washington is going to use the Constitution to ride into Pennsylvania and put down the Whiskey Rebellion. The Constitution worked. And that's exactly the legacy that Washington wanted to leave. One legacy he was not too happy about, though, was political division within the country. It's during Washington's presidency that we start to see the development of the two-party systems. Two political parties are going to evolve out of his presidency: the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton, and they believed in a strong central government, focusing the economy more on the urban and elite interest of the nation. The other party, the Democratic Republicans, that's going to be led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And they believed in more of a state-centered government, more states' rights. And they believed the American economy should be centered around the rural part of our country and agriculture. Now, Washington is going to set another precedent on his exit from office, because after 2 terms, he is going to resign as president. That precedent is going to remain intact until the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt becomes president. But when Washington leaves, he gives a farewell address. And in his farewell address, he warns the United States to avoid certain things. Number one, he said, avoid political parties. And he also said, avoid getting entangled in foreign alliances. He said, as long as you don't do those 2 things, country should be fine. Well, sorry, George, that didn't quite work out. So who's going to take his place? Well, the next man up is sitting Vice President John Adams. John Adams was a Federalist who was pro-British, and he's going to come in, and right when he enters office, a war is going to break out between Great Britain and France. But Adams chooses to remain neutral. It's a little bit difficult, though, because he's dealing with France continually seizing American trade vessels. So to try to handle this issue, he's going to send American dignitaries over to France to negotiate an end to this practice. When they arrive in France, they're contacted by 3 French diplomats. And these diplomats demanded a bribe before they would even let them talk to the French government. Well, they were so angry by this, the Americans went back to the United States. And when it was reported, the dignitaries from France were listed as agents X, Y, and Z. And what became known as the XYZ affair is actually going to unify both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans in anger against the French. Well, Adams couldn't just let sleeping dogs lie. And he is going to go to Congress and he's going to ask for the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts basically gave Congress the power to deport any non-citizen they deemed fit to be deported. This was primarily focused not on the French, but on the Scottish and the Irish immigrants in our country, because they were quick to criticize the government based on our relationship with Great Britain. And if you know anything about the Scottish and the Irish, there's no love lost between them and Great Britain. Not only that, the Sedition Act made it illegal to criticize the federal government publicly. Well, the Democratic Republicans are just honestly ticked off about all of this. They said these actions are violating the Constitution. They're violating the rights of American citizens. And as a result, or as a response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are going to be written. And what these resolutions essentially said was that the states had the right to nullify any federal law that they felt went beyond the provisions of the U.S. Constitution. Well, with all this drama, it should be no surprise to you that in the election of 1800, John Adams is not going to be reelected. But that's for another video. I appreciate you watching. Hopefully that gives you a little insight into the early republic days of the United States. We'll see you on the next one.